Work Wellness Institute is transforming research into workplace performance and health. As an organization, we function throughout the complete cycle of turning research into practice, mobilizing knowledge as a research institute, community partner, funder, and educational provider. Our mission of creating safe, healthy, and inclusive workplaces for all is our driving motivation. Learning is a lifelong journey to adapt to the forever changing needs of the workplace. Whether you are a leader, a professional, an academic, or a student, we provide high-quality resources that are evidence-based, topical, and relevant to all industries. Choose the Work Wellness Institute as your learning journey partner and become a member to gain full access to our diverse knowledge mobilization programming, including lectures on demand, e-curriculum, 3 distinct certification opportunities, and more. Continue to learn and connect with the Work Wellness Institute and see how we can support transforming research into performance and health for your workplace.
Very excited to move into the main event today, and we're so excited to have Dr. Margaret Oldfield with us today. Dr. Oldfield is a social scientist and disability scholar with wide-ranging interests. Inspired by her experience with chronic illness, she focuses on changing workplaces so people with episodic disabilities can stay employed. She partnered on CCRW's Disability Confidence in Finance project and collaborates on McMaster University's project, The Impact of Remote Work on Workplace Accessibility for Persons with Disabilities. Dr. Oldfield gives workshops on academic writing and coaches graduate students and U of T undergraduates with disabilities, and she publishes and presents her work both nationally and internationally. So again, we're just so excited that she is joining us today and sharing her expertise. So more than welcome to pass things over to you. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Oldfield.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that introduction. I'm an invisibly impaired white older woman with chin-length gray and brown hair. So that gives you an idea of what I look like. I'd like to also acknowledge the land that I'm on. I'm speaking to you from Tikaronto, which is an Indigenous name for Toronto. For thousands of years, this has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. If you'd like to check out whose land you're working on, you can click the link called Whose Land App. And this is a beautiful beadwork painting on the right side. So our learning goals today are to recognize why disabled people are bullied at work, understand how ableism underlies this bullying, learn what organizations can do to address it, and apply the learnings to a case study, which Elizabeth mentioned would be in the last half hour. So part 1 is going to be my lecture, and part 2 is going to be the case study with discussion. So a little note about language. Often what you'll see in descriptions of people with disabilities is the term people with disabilities. This is called person-first language. You'll see it in some of the graphs that I'm going to show you in the report. But my preference, the work that I do, is using the social model of disability, which you might have heard of as well. This model assumes that social and physical environments disable people, not their impairments. So to go along with that, if I am talking about a particular person and their impairments, I use the term person with impairment. So here's our first poll. Do you want a poll, which of course includes Asian people, Indigenous people, and Black people? But what I wanted to point out is the groups at the bottom of the list, Indigenous and Black populations in Canada, get a lot of press and a lot of attention. And also we hear a lot about recent immigrants in the media, but we hear very little about disability issues and disabled people. This surprises me. So I wanted to show you this statistic and I wanted you to learn about it. So here we have the kinds of people, the kinds of impairments that people have in Canada. And again, this language is not mine, it's from Stats Canada. As you can see from the top line, The largest group of people, the largest group of impairments is pain related, which of course is pain is something invisible. As you look down the list, you'll also see other invisible impairments like mental health related, hearing, developmental disabilities, and unknown. And we don't have a division of what that is. So why does bullying of disabled people matter, particularly to employees? That's to employers. First of all, it lowers employee morale, job satisfaction, and intent to stay in the job in the organization. It can damage the workplace climate. It harms the organization's reputation among its employees and external stakeholders like customers, for example. It can decrease productivity. And in a British survey that I use throughout this presentation, 20% of bullied employees, not just disabled bullied employees, but bullied employees in total left the organization. So for employers, this can lead to a loss of quite useful people, not just their talents, but their skills and expertise are lost when they quit. And it costs money to replace the people who've left who were bullied in recruitment, hiring, onboarding, training, and extra work for team members while they wait for the person who left to be replaced. And certainly most organizations want to retain disabled employees to meet their EDI goals. So I want to show you the stigma process. This is something that happens to employees with differences, not just impairments, but any other kind of difference from the general population of employees. And stigma is embedded in lots of things, not just attitudes, but work relationships, the work environment, workplace culture, and employer policies, as I'll show you later. So what happens is that first, somebody with a difference is labeled. And if the stigma process continues, that label is negatively stereotyped. After the person's been negatively stereotyped, they're separated out as a them. And then there becomes this us-them dynamic. That causes them to lose status and to be very vulnerable to discrimination. And going along with stigma process is ableism. These are systems, attitudes, and behaviors that focus on impairments rather than abilities. So they are, in the social model, disabling. Ableism devalues people with impairments. It often drastically underestimates the quality of their lives and presumes that they're constantly suffering, which you see in the media a lot. You'll read a person suffering from mental illness, a person suffering from multiple sclerosis, a person suffering from diabetes, whether they're suffering or not. So I think that really influences how people think about impairments, that they're entirely negative. So here's some, this is from one of the British studies. Excuse me, I'll go backwards. That gives an example of attitudes toward disabled employees. The survey found that 20% of employed people acknowledged prejudice that was happening in their workplaces. 22% agreed that people with disabilities couldn't be as effective at work as people without disabilities. 18% said their colleagues would mind a lot or a little if a suitably qualified person with a disability became their boss. And 19% said most people at work would feel very or fairly comfortable if somebody spoke negatively about disabled people, including making jokes or using offensive language. So this is around 20% of the workforce population in this survey, and I find that pretty shocking. So one thing that underlies bullying is systematic or systemic ableism. And here's a quote by a person that I mentored named Shannon Giamatsulu. She talks about bullying hiding physical and verbal violence rooted in systems of oppression, which could be ableism, racism, sexism, and many other kinds of oppression. She says that this systematic or systemic oppression as bullying leads to individual solutions, focusing on the bully and their victim, not solutions that challenge and dismantle systems of oppression like ableism. And in fact, if you approach bullying in an individual way, you allow the oppression to persist. I found this quite compelling. So there's a lot of data on this table that I will quickly look at, and you can read the other lines at your leisure when you get the copy of the slides in a couple of weeks or so. And my main message in this slide is that disabled employees are more bullied than non-disabled employees. For example, 41% of people in, this is a different British survey, people with impairments said that they had been given an unmanageable workload or impossible deadlines. 35% said that their employer didn't follow proper procedures, and 37% said they'd been shouted at or someone had lost their temper at them. So basically, this list is showing you the variety of bullying that can happen in workplaces. So here are some other kinds of bullying. In terms of relationships with supervisors or the work environment, we often see links to systemic ableism that underlie bullying. One example is isolating someone. Another example is constantly changing their work. A third example could be removing responsibility, putting somebody under pressure, which was mentioned in the previous slide, downgrading their duties, or transferring somebody without their involvement into a different job. The literature that I looked at, you'll see at the bottom of the screen, also mentioned that supervisors can harass employees when they're on disability leave. This could be through pressuring to return them to work, calling them constantly, and sometimes threatening to lay them off or fire them if they don't return to work. And then there's systemic ableism that's embedded in employer policies and procedures. One example that I've seen in my own research is punitive attendance management. These are policies or attendance management procedures that penalize the employee the more sick leave they take. And someone with a chronic illness, for example, an invisible impairment, may take more sick leave than another employee, and they get penalized for it with this kind of a policy. Productivity expectations have come up before. Expecting workers to be normal. The expected worker used to be, we used to say, is a man when women were entering the workforce. And now it's somebody who's expected to be normal. Of course, there's no normal. Everybody's different, but employers may have an idea of the pacing of work, the expectations of how much somebody can produce in a day, how many times they should be off sick based on some kind of average. Another example is requiring medical proof of impairment to get accommodations. You have to go through a doctor to be approved as qualified disabled person. So I'm going to move along here. I've got quite a lot of material on the slides, and I invite you to peruse them later on at your leisure. So the Canadian surveys that I found, they're on the bottom of the screen, echo the results of the British surveys. One survey of federal government employees found that disabled employees were twice as likely to report harassment as non-disabled employees. And they also found that this harassment varied by age. The youngest disabled employees had the lowest likelihood of being harassed, and and people who were in their 30s and 40s and late 20s were increasingly likely to be harassed. And then, interestingly, the risk of harassment decreased with age after 44, but it was still higher than the youngest group. The second study was of mostly unionized, mostly permanent employees from across Canada who responded to an online survey. And of course, this probably underestimates harassment among people who were in more vulnerable, non-unionized positions. And again, this study found that disabled employees experienced significantly more harassment and violence than non-disabled employees. but interestingly, less than Indigenous employees. The only group that experienced more were Indigenous employees, and that would be something that's different from the British situation. So who bullies disabled employees? That one of the British studies found that 41 to 47% of their respondents reported that it was employers, line managers, or supervisors who bullied them. 25 to 31% reported that it was clients or customers, and this is a surprise to me. And 17 to 21% reported that their co-workers or their colleagues had bullied them. So I want to tell you about a process that I first read from the work of Margaret Vickers in Australia. She talked mostly about women with multiple sclerosis. And then I've seen this process happen in my own research and in the research of other people, where bullying may push a disabled employee out. And this is how it happens. When the disabled employee is bullied, it becomes a very stressful situation. So if they already have a physical impairment, they have a new one, mental distress. If they have an invisible impairment, often a chronic illness, this stress exacerbates their symptoms. So on top of exacerbating their symptoms and the symptoms getting worse, they have a new impairment, mental distress. They go back to their doctor probably several times in trying to deal with this bullying and how it's making them ill. And eventually the doctor says, I think you should leave your job. So they leave their job, and the official reason is the impairment or the chronic illness in many cases. But the real source is the bullying, and this is hidden. So here's our second poll. And the question, the column where it says physical disability or illness, which is a visible impairment, has the fewest number of types of bullying. And then they increase as you go to the right, which is the groups of employees with invisible impairments. So as this British survey reported, employees with invisible impairments are much more bullied than non-disabled employees as a whole. And that people with physical impairments, the left column, are much more similar to non-disabled employees in the rate of bullying than the two groups of people with invisible impairments. So a little bit about invisible impairments. They fluctuate, they're not constant. Pain, as we saw in the first graph, is the most common impairment in Canada. Mental health related impairments are the fourth most common. And some of these impairments not only are invisible, but very misunderstood, and some are more stigmatized as others. For example, mental illnesses and chronic pain. Some of the ways that they're stigmatized is that these impairments are viewed as not real, in particular chronic pain. And so coworkers and often supervisors assume that the person is malingering or making it up. So now I'm going to move into talking about how what employers can do to reduce some of this bullying of disabled people. And I'm going to introduce you to this idea that I call the onion. And eventually I'm going to get my blue onion to turn to brown and a bit red. So the first group that it's the group that says worker at the very center of the onion is the employees with impairments. And next level layer outward is relationships at work and their quality. And then the third layer outward is the work environment, workplace culture, job tasks, physical space, and so on. And all of these layers are affected by the fourth layer, the employer, which is the employer policies, the procedures, the employee benefits, the leaves, and anything that has to do with all employees. And of course, life outside work can enable or disable employment. And government plays a large role in disabled people even getting into the workforce or deciding to enter the workforce or deciding to leave. And of course, the last layer, the outermost layer, societal beliefs or social attitudes, affects all of the other layers. So I have tons of ideas on the next slides about what employers can do at different layers of the onion. And I might skip some of them. So again, I invite you to go over them when you get the slides. And I'm going to start with employees with impairments, which is the innermost layer. And you might remember from Shannon's quote that there are many kinds of isms or systemic impressions happening at the same time. So intersecting identities like gender and age, for example, can complicate bullying. Somebody could be bullied not only because they're disabled, but because they're an older worker or a woman. And then I explained on the left side that significantly more workplace harassment happens to disabled women than disabled men. And older workers are more likely to be harassed and bullied than younger workers. Younger workers are also, particularly the group under 25 that was in the other slide, are more likely to have entered the workforce with impairments. So they've had time in their life. They might have been born with the impairment. They've already had time to learn through school and post-secondary education, perhaps, how to negotiate accommodations, how to make the world work for them. And the older workers are more likely to be impaired by a chronic illness, and this is more likely to happen when they're on the job. Could be a work injury, which is directly related to work, or it could be an illness. And they've suddenly become a disabled person. This is new for them. They need to learn how to negotiate and negotiate the world and negotiate the way people treat them. So a couple of things that employers can do to help employees with impairments is make it safer to report bullying, certainly believe people and take the reports seriously and investigate them. And they can all help educators, occupational health people can advise disabled employees on how to proceed, whether to disclose, what makes them comfortable, whether to seek other kinds of things that are going to help them at work. So again, we're still in the layer of employees with impairments. Now, one thing that happens with particularly younger disabled employees who come into jobs through agencies that serve disabled people is the agency tend to place disabled job seekers in low-level, low-paid, and low-status jobs, which are quite precarious. This is because of the funding structure that they're under. And disabled employees who are low status and low security are more likely to experience more bullying. So what employers could do is make sure that the person they hire matches the job, or the job the job matches the person, that you recruit job seekers into jobs that fit their educational qualifications. Particularly in research that I've been involved in, we found that people with, say, a post-secondary or college diploma in technology were being placed as cleaners in labs instead of being placed as technologists in labs. That was an example of a misfit between the job and the person. You also want to be careful not to expect candidates to disclose their impairments or their accommodation needs before they're being hired, particularly with people who have invisible conditions. They don't want to do that because there's a big risk of not being hired. So that's something that you can broach later on after you hire the person. So now we're moving on to the second layer, work relationships with, in particular, coworkers. As I mentioned before, if they don't see a physical impairment, they may resent an accommodation and question whether the impaired employee deserves it, or are they malingering? And then what happens is malicious gossip, which can be very hurtful, not only to the person with the impairment, but to their career. We found that employees' willingness to help someone else who needs some help and has an impairment, it depends. It depends on the other person's age, how long they've been with the company, how often they need help, and whether the person is well-liked. Unfortunately, there's studies showing that people who are well-liked get more help and get more accommodations. Coworkers also want to be consulted on accommodations that will affect them because it may affect the workload. But the problem is this information is private. So one thing that employers can do is ask disabled employees when they negotiate accommodations, if they're willing, if the supervisor can share information about their invisible impairments and the accommodations, with coworkers. Again, this is leaving it up to the employee to say yes or no, because it is their right to have that information be private. And then that will allow the supervisor to consult the workers about accommodations that will help affect them and hopefully smooth the waters a bit. So next we're moving on to work relationships with supervisors. And again, on the left, there's lots of issues. This is I found in my research that supervisors felt sandwiched between wanting to help their employees get accommodations, get what they need, and feeling pressured by upper managers to control costs. They're juggling employees' individual requests with hectic work scheduling, high production demands, maintaining morale and cooperation on the team, and the impracticality to them of some accommodation requests. So here are what employers can do. Reinsure newly diagnosed employees, particularly if they have an illness, perhaps like cancer, that the supervisor will help them stay at work or return to work after disability or medical leave. A good idea is when a person is off on disability or medical leave, to keep in touch with them, to remind them that the work team is thinking of them, but not, of course, to pressure them to return to work. And before they go on leave, to tell employees that they are entitled to leave if that's one of their benefits, and supports that they can access while on leave, perhaps counseling, certainly prescription drugs if that's offered by the employer. Now we're moving on to the next layer, the work environment. And we noted in one of the slides that customers or clients may bully disabled employees in customer-facing jobs. Unfortunately, in the literature that I looked at, I didn't find any suggestions to ameliorate this situation, other than thinking of signs that I've seen in hospitals saying, we will not accept bullying of our reception staff. That might work. There might be some other ideas. Perhaps some of you have some ideas. So what other experts recommend is fostering relationship-focused workplaces, meaning build good relationships, keep relationships at work under good repair. Institute practices like timed agendas, communicating about meetings in advance, and giving people time to read materials, quiet spaces where they can rest if it's a hectic environment, and flexibility of many kinds. And we'll talk about that in a little while. So workplace culture is a very important part of the work environment. And here are a few of the issues. If it would be possible, and this could be one of our aims, is to make ableism as socially unacceptable as sexism or racism. And I'm 71 years old, so I remember decades ago when there was a lot of sexism in not just the workplace, in everywhere. And as a young woman, I got quite a lot of sexism in my life. And now we wouldn't think of that as acceptable. We are working on racism, but it's not considered acceptable anywhere near the way it was in white communities maybe 40 years ago. So there have been some changes. But with ableism, most people don't know what it is. So that's a goal, is to make it as socially unacceptable as sexism is now. And to remind you that equity, diversity, and inclusion is for disabled employees isn't just about making physical spaces accessible. As you can see, there's a lot of other issues going on. So some examples of what employers can do to challenge ableism is do an ableism audit of your workplace culture, of your workplace, not just for accessibility. Look at the processes, how people get along, what people say, and audit and see what you may find some of the issues that come up that underlie bullying. So before we get to, we're going to start with employer policies, which is the next layer in the onion, and the last one that I'm going to talk about. And this is from a Canadian study that was done across Canada, and it shows the percentage of respondents who said their workplaces had the following policies. And this is a surprise because provinces and territories usually require employers to have these policies responding and preventing bullying. But as you can see, the respondents said that only 71% or 67% of their workplaces had these policies, not 100. And even less so were clear reporting procedures, no retaliation for reporting bullying policies, and a reporting hotline, very low on reporting hotlines. So you can see we need work there. So I would suggest that you look into whether your organization has these policies and procedures. And on top of that, are they effective? Can you evaluate their effectiveness? There's no point having a policy if it's not enforced and it's not implemented, then it's not effective at all. So I'm going to speed up a little bit here. So again, I invite you to read all these ideas. There's lots of them, and I'll cover a couple in each slide. So in terms of employer procedures, which are the ways that policies are implemented, we saw on the previous slide that these are often not clearly, there's no clear procedures, and policies are not followed or poorly followed. They have vague definitions. And so frequently that leads to dismissal of complaints against managers. What employers can do, evaluate policy enforcement, collect data, I recommend, to track patterns and so you can address them. And regularly survey all employees, confidentially of course, on their experiences of bullying. So I want to cover, I'll do this quickly, there'll be more in the slides that you can read later on. The problems I see with accommodations. First of all, accommodations, the idea of accommodating an employee is based on the human rights model of disability, not the social model. It's seen as an individual problem that requires an individual solution. And the onus is on the disabled employee to negotiate accommodation, which can be very, very stressful. Indeed, it's a flashpoint for bullying by supervisors. So it puts the employee at risk of bullying. It also requires employees to disclose at least a need. So they have to reveal that there's something different about them that needs to be accommodated. If the accommodation is refused, which happens in about a third of the cases, according to the Canadian Survey on Disability, then what happens? Does the employee leave? Are they pushed out? Things may change over time, particularly with an invisible impairment that's an injury or an illness. The person has to go back and renegotiate the accommodation because their impairment has changed. So here's some more problems with accommodations. If the person chooses to disclose a difference, let alone an impairment, which they may not be required to disclose, it may endanger their job, particularly if they're in a precarious job. It can leave them open to stereotyping and discrimination because people now know they have some kind of impairment. It can even damage their workplace relationships, limit their career involvement and their job loss. So actually, from the Canadian Disability Survey, the figure, I think it was a third of people didn't get the accommodations they asked for, but more importantly, almost half of disabled employees didn't seek accommodations for these reasons, that they can be risky, during the whole process can be risky. So what I propose is universal supports. These are alternatives to accommodations, and they're actually popular with people with invisible impairments in some of the research that we've done. We found that particularly people with mental illnesses, didn't negotiate formal accommodations. Sometimes they tried to get informal accommodations if they had a good relationship with their supervisor. But more often, they use what was available for all employees, like prescription drug coverage, flexible hours, work at home, many kinds of leave that employers may offer. And so here's some examples of the leaves that employers can offer. that anybody can access, and this doesn't require disclosing that you have an impairment or any kind of difference. So it's much safer. And I'm glad to see that people thought this was an important route for addressing bullying, is consulting disabled employees. Affinity groups were an idea in federally regulated industries. Any organization can set one up for disabled employees or invite the employees to set one up themselves. And this can become a group that can be consulted. And another way to ask about these groups is ask how can the organization reduce barriers in procedures like performance evaluation, career advancement, and attendance management. And I noticed that a lot of people said training. That's often the first go-to, but I question whether it's the best one. What's the purpose of training? Is it to change attitudes and behavior? Is it to raise awareness of policies and procedures? These are all individual, it's trying to change individuals, but that's not enough. You need to change systemic ableism, as I mentioned, in all the layers of the onion from the employer down. So I suggest before planning training, look at, is it the most effective way to reduce bullying? Are there other initiatives you could take that might be more effective? Initiatives that, as I've suggested, target the other layers of the onion besides the individual and their work relationships. Here we go. Certainly study the slides when you get them, because there's a lot more information on the slides and ideas about what employers can do than I was able to tell you during the webinar. And of course, please try to put what you've learned into action. One way you can do this is sprinkling the information that you learn into conversations with colleagues and at meetings. You could bring up the idea of intersectionality, which is intersecting identities, as you mentioned, but you can have more than one identity. You can be a woman with be a visible minority and have an invisible impairment. And all of these three identities will affect your work life in different ways, perhaps, and the combination will affect your work. If you feel like bringing up yourself as an example. Otherwise, you can bring up other ideas on the slides. And to bring up I purposely divided the slides into issues and then what employers can do. Those ideas you can bring up with your managers, your coworkers, your executives, in any kind of town halls that you have in your organization. And of course, one of my encouragements is to look beyond individuals as the problem in bullying, and look at systemic ableism in procedures, in hiring, in policies, in the workplace culture. And lastly, I'd like to leave you with the message of keep your senses open. I was going to call this spidey senses, but that's what I'm trying to get at, is keep all your senses open for ableism in all the onion layers, particularly also government and societal beliefs, which we didn't talk about. So I'm just going to continue with the takeaway messages that bullying is ableism in action, which is one of the themes that I tried to get across, that disabled employers are more bullied than non-disabled employees, that bullying, often individualized, is actually something systemic. And that's where a lot of bullying happens, or the facilitators for bullying are put in place by systemic ableism. I suggest that you look beyond the individual bully-victim dynamic to systemic ableism and look at the onion layers beyond employees and work relationships, the policies, the work environment, the workplace culture, and the procedures. As I just mentioned, intersecting identities complicate bullying. And as we talked about in the question period, I encourage you to strengthen universal supports as an alternative, not a replacement, but an alternative to accommodation, so that people, particularly people with invisible impairments, who are the greater group who get bullied, have an option to do something, to use something that every employee can get, without disclosing their difference, which is where the problems come in and the bullying happens.
Continue to learn and connect with the Work Wellness Institute and see how we're transforming research into workplace performance and health at www.workwellnessinstitute.org.